This black man as a janitor was noticed by a white professor on his first day. The professor gave him a pair of scissors. He gently picked up the test tube after taking the scissors. The professor was a bit surprised, but told him to use his left hand. This time, he not only finished easily, but also used both hands to put the cork back together. The professor found it hard to believe. He had been practicing this technique for decades. But this young man in his 20s to be able to do it so easily. Then, the professor asked, "What is the instrument on the table called?" The black man replied, "That's the Van Slyke manometer, professor." Such a complicated instrument was answered correctly, and the professor praised him even more. The next day, Thomas wore a white blouse shirt and was given the privilege of being the professor's assistant. Looking at himself in the mirror, Thomas was extremely proud. Because he was childhood, he always dreamed of becoming a doctor. Because of the poor family, he only studied until high school and had to go out to work. Despite this, Thomas still did not give up his dream. Therefore, he chose to work as a cleaning staff in the medical institute. The main purpose is that without working hours, he can look all kinds of medical books at the same time. He also understood that as a professor's assistant, he had to work even harder. Before the 70s in America, the black people want to be recognized. They need to know how to seize the opportunity. Soon, under the professor's direction, Thomas received his first experimental opportunity. Because to verify the results of drug research, they took a dog as an experiment. The professor drew a line. He told Thomas to operate along that line. Anesthesia, knife incision, artery detection, all movements are extremely skillful. The surgery was extremely successful, but as soon as the incision was sutured, the professor discovered it again. Thomas did not turn on the device before stitching. This also meant that he missed his chance to prove to the world that his experiment was successful. Thomas explains, "I don't know how to set the recording device." The professor was extremely angry and scolded him. "Are all my words the wind in your ears? God damned. Whatever I have to do, all day's hard work is in vain. Can't you do anything right?" Hearing the professor's words, Thomas was a little moved. He thought he had a chance, but here he was not respected. Thomas was leaving when the professor saw a note. It turned out that Thomas soon recorded the surgery on paper. Moreover, he takes as very detailed and meticulous every surgical step. The professor realized that he had mistakenly blamed him. He immediately chased after Thomas and apologized to him. He promised that he would not do so again in the future. Seeing the professor's sincere attitude, Thomas wavered slightly. Anyway, it's extremely rare for a white person to apologize to a black person in this day. Then he chose to forgive the professor. Very quickly, their experiment was published in the medical world. This time the professor won a position at the Johns Hopkins Hospital. While sending out his thanks, which was the result of their research, he did not mention Thomas. The reason is very simple, because he is black. After returning home, his wife had some resentment. Because of his ideals, his family had to leave their hometown. They lives in a small, dark room, day in and day out. It's not easy for him to get a little bit of achievement, but to be accidentally abandoned. Although he was not willing, he understood more. What does Johns Hopkins Hospital mean? That place is the dream of all doctors. What's more, there they can study a new disease. It's a congenital heart disease, also known as a congenital heart defect. Thomas believes that as long as he overcomes this difficult hurdle, he will definitely have a bright future. But he did not expect that, for black people. Not only studying, even the door of Johns Hopkins Hospital he could not enter. Wait a minute. The black man must scan their pass at the back door. He's with me. Even so, it can't be. Can congenital heart disease be cured? It's hard to imagine. When the heart stops working, it will be like. Once infected with this disease, the blood cannot reach the lungs. The children will have pale faces, have to use the knee-to-knee position to relieve pain. Before the 1970s in the United States, the surgical surgery became the only hope of children. After receiving the assignment, the professor and Thomas began research. First, the problem of aortic obstruction in the lungs needs to be addressed. Thomas suggested using an artificial catheter. The connection between the heart and the pulmonary artery, and from there blood flows to the lungs. For this idea, the professor also expressed his approval. But this type of surgery is extremely complicated. Children's blood vessels are very small, ordinary surgical forceps are completely unusable. Moreover, medical equipment was extremely scarce at that time. In the hospital, not even a ventilator is available. So, Thomas wrung his brains out to use mechanical engineering, make a homemade miniature surgical forceps. Then, through the knowledge in the book, build a ventilator yourself. The surgical tools are now fully available. The next comes the experiment. They found a dog, imagining a dog with a congenital heart disease. Then they try the feasibility of miniature surgical forceps. Finally, after testing over 200 dogs, Thomas's surgical technique reached the perfect level. He was even able to close his eyes and feel during surgery. because through many experiments, he was familiar and mastered all the blood vessels in the palm of his hand. At this moment, a white doctor walked in. Seeing this wonderful operation, he was extremely impressed. He had never seen such a miraculous trick. He hopes to be able to become colleagues with Thomas. Thomas was happy that he finally had some standing in the eyes of the white man. But the reality is not like that. When he went to work, the cleaning staff still used discriminatory eyes to look at him. As he walked, the eyes of the white people around him were all on him. At lunchtime, even the black man taunted him and said he was just a third-level staff. Third-level staff? Thomas was a little confused. He sought out someone and knew that he was just a low-level employee in the hospital. That employee level will determine the salary. He is always dedicated to researching pathology and working 16 hours a day. Each month, they receive a salary of $20. He thought that everyone's salary was not high. No wonder the lowest salary is only him. Even angrier is that he has been doing this job for 13 years. Will someone really live for an ideal? Anyway, he still needs to live with his family. Thomas assumed that it was all arranged by the professor. But in reality, the professor did not know anything about administrative matters. The professor then went to Thomas's house and explained what had happened. At the same time, he helped him claim $300 of allowance. The position has been promoted to surgical technician. Not only that, the professor also brought another good news. Their experiment has entered the clinical phase. Their dedication is about to succeed after more than 10 years. Thomas thanked the professor for claiming justice for him, also extremely looking forward to the day of clinical surgery. But he did not expect that before the surgery, the professor received a notice that the black people is not to allow into the operating room. They had worked together for almost 20 years. The professor was used to Thomas's existence. It could even be said that Thomas's technique could not be replaced by anyone. The professor wanted to give him a chance, but it took a long time. Thomas could wait, but the poor kids couldn't. In the eyes of others, this is just an ordinary tool. But in Thomas's eyes, this was the key to saving his life. The congenital heart disease has developed. The child's face becomes more pale. The baby was pushed onto the operating screen, wearing an oxygen ventilator. When everything was ready, the professor suddenly stopped all movements. This action of his has caused a stir among experts. It turned that this is the first heart surgery in the history of medicine. Because children's blood vessels are so small, Thomas's homemade forceps are key. But in this age of racism, black people are not eligible to participate in surgery. The professor felt irritated. He rushed out of the operating room. Ignoring everyone's objections, he asked Thomas into the operating room. Dr. Thomas is not there. Immediately go to the operating room. After receiving the notice, Thomas immediately ran over. But as soon as he entered the operating room, he was stopped by the leader. But at this moment, the whole world is watching. The leaders should have compromised. The surgery begins. The real professor of surgery, Thomas, stood behind him. For each move, the professor had to consult Thomas. Even using any tools and any methods are approved by Thomas. The experts debated in the stands. And on the operating table has also reached an important stage. The professor wields Thomas's homemade forceps to grab the tiny blood vessels leading to the heart. Thomas meticulously watched his every move. In the end, with the efforts of the doctors, the surgery was successfully completed. That is to say, they have paved the way for heart surgery. The professor, with everyone's cheers, walked out of the operating room. Suddenly, the news spread all over the world. The professor's reputation was also pushed to the top. At this moment, his colleague's words pierced his heart. He was lucky to have that nigger help him. Let's see what he can do without that nigger. The professor felt his dignity had been humiliated. And he thought it was all Thomas's fault. And he took out all his anger on Thomas. During the interview, the professor and the doctors took a photo together. When speeching the award, the professor also introduced the name of each doctor. But the sad thing is that the professor never mentioned Thomas by name. As if his success had nothing to do with him. Thomas once again fell into the abyss. He originally thought that making achievements could be recognized. In the end, it was just a futile effort. He went to the professor and wanted to resign. The professor felt that Thomas was starting to riot. Why are you like that? Thomas says, this time the person I blame is not them, but you. I have followed you all the way. But now for what? This is how you repay me. In the end, Thomas was completely desperate, choosing to compromise. Through selling drugs and medicine, his life gradually stabilized. Everyone in the house assumed that his choice was correct. Anyway, the money earned from the medical institute is quite a lot. But his wife only understood, Thomas was not happy either. Because he was born to be a doctor. He left the hospital but his heart is still there. Under the encouragement of his wife, Thomas sought out the professor of reconciliation. He does not need fame or benefits, but for his passionate ideal. Just like that, he worked at the hospital for 20 years. He has trained many excellent surgeons. Not to mention his surgery also saved many small lives. At this time, the professor was late in the afternoon. Seeing the portrait hanging on his wall, the past memories came back to him. They have changed from a master-servant relationship to a teacher-student relationship. And finally, colleagues. During 24 years of cooperation, the two's hard work has cemented this strong friendship. But not long after, the professor passed away from a serious illness. They were inseparable and now only one remains. Finally, thanks to the non-stop dedication over the past decades, Thomas finally earned everyone's respect. In 1976, Johns Hopkins Hospital awarded him a prestigious doctorate degree. At the same time, he also gave him a portrait. The stigma for decades has finally ended at this moment. He quietly looked at the portrait hanging on the wall. Suddenly, his tears welled up. If it is said that youthful enthusiasm is in the past, remember the past. Because that is the depths of our souls. Where the dreams are most evident.